In 1956, mobster Albert Anastasia ordered Bumpy Johnson to kneel before 40 made men at Ralph's restaurant. Bumpy's response: he grabbed a steak knife, aimed it at Anastasia's heart, and froze every killer in that room with one calculated move. When the executioner blinks first, what just died the order? Or the man Ralph's restaurant should have been locked up tight at 9:15 p.m. Instead, the front door got bolted from the inside, and the only men who walked through it were the kind who'd already put enough corpses in the East River to choke the current. No busboys clearing plates, no waiters refilling wine glasses, just 40 stone-cold killers packed into a room that reeked of cigar smoke. Cheap cologne, and the kind of violence that doesn't need a gun to make you feel it crawling up your spine. This wasn't a dinner party. This was a slaughterhouse with tablecloths. Every man breathing that stale air had blood caked under his fingernails, metaphorically. Literally. Permanently. These were the executioners, the enforcers, the made men who'd strangled rivals with piano wire, dissolved bodies in acid drums, and beaten men to death with baseball bats just to send a message. And tonight, every single one of them had their eyes glued to the same piece of meat sitting in the center of the room. Bumpy Johnson. He sat in the chair they reserve for dead men walking not at the head of the table where bosses sit, but smack in the middle of the horseshoe where they put you when they're about to gut your reputation in front of the entire underworld. The lights were dim enough to hide the hate in their eyes, but not dim enough to miss the sweat starting to bead on foreheads. Bumpy's suit was charcoal gray, pressed sharp as a switchblade, and his hands rested flat on the white linen like a man who'd already written his own eulogy and signed it in blood. No trembling, no second-guessing, just the kind of eerie stillness you see in a man who's made peace with dying tonight. To his left sat Michael "Trigger Mike" Coppola, a Genovese hitter who'd personally executed 17 men, some begging, some screaming, all of them bleeding out while Mike finished his sandwich. To Bumpy's right was Anthony "Tough Tony" Anastasio, Albert's blood brother, the union boss who could have your legs broken on a Tuesday and your family evicted by Friday. And standing directly behind Bumpy, so close his breath was fogging up the back of Bumpy's neck, was Vincent the Chin Gigante, 26 years old, already notorious for caving in skulls with his bare fists and walking away whistling like he'd just taken out the trash. These weren't spectators. These were pallbearers waiting to bury what was left of Bumpy's name. And sitting across from him, dead center in the power seat like a king on a throne built from broken bones, was Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, the most feared killer in the history of the American Mafia, the man who'd personally greenlit over 60 murders and slept like a baby every single night. He'd turned Murder Incorporated into a death factory efficient, ruthless, and colder than a meat locker in January. Anastasia wasn't eating, wasn't drinking, just staring at Bumpy like a surgeon deciding exactly where to make the first incision. Somebody coughed. The sound bounced off the walls like a bullet ricocheting in a cemetery. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved, because every killer in that room understood the script. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a public execution, not with bullets, but with humiliation. Bumpy had been running Harlem like it was his own private empire, raking in millions from the numbers rackets, moving product, controlling territory, and doing it all without paying a single goddamn dime in tribute to the 5 families who actually owned every brick, every street corner, every dirty dollar in New York City. And Albert Anastasia was about to teach him the cost of disrespect. The plan was surgical. Bumpy would stand. He'd walk to the center of the room. He'd drop to his knees in front of 40 witnesses, bosses, underbosses, soldiers, enforcers, and he'd beg for forgiveness like a dog begging for scraps. He'd kiss the ring, admit that Harlem belonged to the Italians, and confess that everything he'd built only existed because they let it exist. Then the story would spread like cancer through every bar, every social club, every back alley card game from Mulberry Street to Atlantic City Bumpy Johnson. The so-called King of Harlem got down on his knees and kissed the feet of his master. Frank Costello, sitting 3 chairs down, struck a match and lit a cigarette without breaking eye contact. The flame illuminated his face just long enough to catch the smirk. He'd seen this ritual 100 times. Big men with big reputations dragged into rooms exactly like this one and reduced to whimpering. Sniveling cowards within minutes. It always ended the same way. They begged. They wept. They gave up everything, their territory, their dignity, their manhood, just to walk out alive. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't begging, wasn't sweating, wasn't even blinking. And that's when Anastasia leaned forward, both elbows on the table, and every man in that room felt their chest tighten. "You know why you're in that chair, don't you?" Anastasia's voice was soft, almost fatherly, the kind of tone a man uses right before he puts a bullet in your brain and tells your widow it was nothing personal. "You've been playing king in Harlem, running numbers, moving weight, stacking cash like you own the whole damn neighborhood. But here's the problem. Bumpy, you don't own shit. You never did. You've been living on borrowed time in a house that belongs to us." Bumpy said nothing, didn't flinch, didn't look away. Anastasia's smile spread slow and mean, like a knife opening a wound. "So here's what happens next. You're gonna stand up. You're gonna walk to the middle of this room, and you're gonna get down on your knees, not because I'm asking, but because if you don't, I'm gonna have Chin snap your spine in half and leave you twitching on this floor while we finish our drinks. Then we'll drag your crippled ass back to Harlem and let every man, woman, and child in that neighborhood see what happens when you forget your place." 40 men leaned forward, 40 predators smelling blood. They weren't waiting to see if Bumpy would kneel. They were betting on how fast he'd crack. 10 seconds. 30. A full minute before the legend shattered and the man underneath started sobbing for mercy. Because in this world, when they sit you in the center of the room and tell you to kneel, you don't walk out with your name intact. You walk out a ghost, or you don't walk out at all. But Bumpy Johnson didn't stand. His hand slid across the tablecloth, slow and deliberate, and wrapped around the handle of his steak knife. Anastasia didn't need to kill Bumpy Johnson. He needed something far more valuable. He needed to break him in front of everyone who mattered, to turn a living legend into a cautionary tale that would echo through every dark corner of the underworld for the next 50 years. Because in Anastasia's world, a bullet to the brain was mercy. It was quick. It was clean. It ended the problem in 3 seconds and gave the dead man a pass straight into legend. But humiliation, public disgrace, forcing a man to his knees in front of 40 witnesses who'd spread the word like gospel. That was power. That was control. That was how you didn't just kill a man, you erased him from history while he was still breathing. Anastasia had built his empire on that principle. He wasn't just the Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated. He was the architect of fear, the master of psychological warfare, the man who understood that the most dangerous weapon in the world wasn't a gun or a knife or a vat of acid. It was shame, the kind of shame that followed you into every room, every conversation, every deal you tried to make for the rest of your miserable life. He'd done it before, dozens of times. Over the years, Anastasia had dragged men into rooms just like this one powerful men. Respected men. Men who thought they were untouchable and forced them to grovel, to apologize, to kiss his ring while their own soldiers watched in silence. And every single one of them had walked out of those rooms as ghosts. Alive. Technically. But dead in every way that mattered. There was Tony. The butcher, Rizzo. A Brooklyn numbers runner who'd made the mistake of skimming profits from a Mangano family operation back in '48. Anastasia didn't have him killed. Instead, he made Tony kneel in front of 30 made men at a social club in Bensonhurst, forced him to admit he was a thief and a coward, then made him kiss Anastasia's shoes, both of them, while everyone watched. Tony was breathing when he left that club, but within 6 months, his entire operation had collapsed. His crew abandoned him. His reputation was gutted. He ended up washing dishes in a diner in Queens, and nobody even remembered his name anymore. Then there was Sal, the Snake, DeLuca, a loan shark who'd gotten too big for his britches in the Bronx. Anastasia brought him to a sit-down at a restaurant in Little Italy, made him apologize for disrespecting the organization, and forced him to hand over half his territory right there at the table while a dozen witnesses nodded in approval. Sal didn't get shot, didn't get beaten, but the word spread fast. Sal DeLuca had bent the knee. Within a year, his business was gone, his reputation was dirt, and he was running penny ante card games out of a basement in Yonkers. That's how Anastasia ruled. Not with bullets, but with rituals. Public ceremonies designed to strip a man of everything he'd built and leave him standing there naked in front of the wolves. Because once you kneel, you can never stand tall again. Once you apologize, you can never demand respect. Once you kiss the ring, your owned body, soul, and reputation. And tonight, Bumpy Johnson was supposed to become the latest name on that list. To Anastasia, Bumpy wasn't a person, he was a problem, a loose end, an exception that needed to be dealt with before it became a precedent. Harlem had been operating outside the rules for too long, a black neighborhood running its own rackets, making its own money, refusing to pay tribute to the 5 families who controlled every other inch of New York. And Bumpy was the symbol of that defiance, the face of Harlem's independence, the man who made people believe you could operate in this city without bowing to the Italians. Anastasia couldn't allow that. Not because Bumpy was a threat to his life. Anastasia had survived wars with men far more dangerous. But because Bumpy was a threat to the order, to the hierarchy, to the unspoken rule that said the Italians owned New York, and everyone else just lived there on borrowed time. So tonight wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about Harlem. Really. This was about sending a message to every hustler, every runner, every wannabe gangster in every borough: nobody is untouchable. Nobody gets to operate outside the system. And if you try, you'll end up on your knees just like Bumpy Johnson. Anastasia leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on Bumpy like a sniper lining up a kill shot. He'd orchestrated this moment with the precision of a military operation. The guest list had been carefully curated representatives from all 5 families, enforcers who'd spread the story, underbosses who needed to see what happened to men who forgot their place. The seating arrangement wasn't random. Bumpy was positioned exactly where Anastasia wanted him, isolated, surrounded, with nowhere to run and no one to back him up. This was a public execution without the body, a crucifixion without the cross, a ritual designed to take everything Bumpy had built over 20 years in Harlem and reduce it to ashes in front of 40 men who would carry the story to every corner of the underworld. And the beauty of it, the sheer brutal genius of Anastasia's plan, was that Bumpy would walk out of this room alive. He'd go back to Harlem breathing, functioning, technically still in charge. But everyone would know. Every hustler, every numbers runner, every street corner boss from 110th Street to 155th would hear the story. Bumpy Johnson got down on his knees and begged Albert Anastasia for permission to keep breathing. That's how you destroy a man, not by stopping his heart, but by breaking his name. Anastasia had done this so many times he could predict every beat. First, the denial, the tough guy act, the refusal to accept reality. Then, the negotiation, the desperate bargaining, the promises to pay tribute, the attempts to find a way out. Then, the collapse, the moment when the man finally understands there's no escape, no deal, no mercy. And finally, the submission, the knees hitting the floor, the apology spilling out, the ring getting kissed while 40 men burn the image into their memory forever. Bumpy was still in stage one. The denial, the defiance, the hand wrapped around that steak knife like it was a magic talisman that could save him from the inevitable. Anastasia smiled. He'd seen men cling to weapons before. It never changed the outcome, because Anastasia didn't rule with death. He ruled with the moment before death, that instant when a man realizes he's already lost everything. And the only question left is whether he'll beg quietly or scream. Tonight, Bumpy Johnson was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Bumpy Johnson didn't have an army, didn't have a seat at the commission table where the real decisions got made, didn't have politicians stuffing their pockets with his money, or judges signing blank warrants in his name, or cops executing his enemies in back alleys and calling it self-defense. On paper, stacked up against the 5 families who controlled New York like warlords carving up a conquered city. Bumpy Johnson was a ghost, a street-level hustler running illegal gambling in a black neighborhood that the Italians barely acknowledged existed. But Anastasia had made one catastrophic mistake. He thought power came from fear, from bodies, from the ability to walk into a room and know that every man breathing in it would piss himself before crossing you. He thought if you had enough soldiers, enough guns, enough shallow graves scattered across 3 states, you owned the territory. Bumpy Johnson understood something Anastasia's brutal. Simple mind could never grasp real power isn't taken. It's given. And in Harlem, Bumpy didn't rule through terror. He existed as the spine holding up a body that would collapse into convulsions the second he disappeared. Harlem wasn't territory you conquered with bullets and threats. Harlem was a living organism, a tangle of barbershops on Lenox Avenue where men got their hair cut and their problems solved. Churches on 125th Street where preachers knew which sins to ignore. Basement numbers joints where grandmothers bet their grocery money and won enough to keep the lights on. After-hours clubs where jazz musicians and hustlers and pimps and working women created their own economy outside the law. All of it connected through invisible veins of trust. Loyalty, blood debts, and the understanding that survival meant protecting your own. And Bumpy Johnson sat dead center in that network, not as a dictator cracking whips, but as the man who kept the whole fragile machine from tearing itself apart. When cops raided too hard, Bumpy made calls that got the heat turned down. When landlords tried to evict entire buildings, Bumpy's money showed up and rent got paid. When Italian mobsters from downtown tried to flood Harlem with heroin that would have turned the neighborhood into a graveyard, Bumpy made sure those shipments disappeared, and the men pushing them ended up floating in the Hudson with their throats cut ear to ear. He wasn't Robin Hood, wasn't some saint handing out charity. Bumpy broke legs when debts went unpaid, ordered executions on rivals who got too ambitious, put men in the ground without losing sleep. But he did it with a code, a line he wouldn't cross. He took his cut from the numbers, the policy games, the loan sharking, but he also made damn sure the community got theirs, made sure the violence stayed controlled, made sure Harlem had a buffer between them and the kind of predatory, scorched earth brutality that would have gutted the neighborhood and left nothing but corpses and burned-out buildings. That's why the barbershops stayed loyal, why the preachers looked the other way when Bumpy walked past, why the grandmothers sitting on stoops knew his name and nodded respect when he tipped his hat. He wasn't their oppressor. He was their insurance policy. The devil they knew, who kept the worst devils at bay. You couldn't buy that kind of loyalty. You couldn't beat it into people. You couldn't threaten it into existence. It grew slow, over decades, built on 1,000 small acts paying a widow's rent, getting a kid out of jail, making sure the cops who shot an unarmed black man in the street had to answer questions they couldn't dodge. Anastasia looked at Bumpy and saw a lone gangster who needed to be humiliated into submission. What he couldn't see, what his violence-soaked brain could never comprehend, was the infrastructure. The invisible architecture of reciprocal obligation that meant if Bumpy disappeared, the entire ecosystem would implode. If Bumpy died tomorrow, who would negotiate with the precinct captains? Who would make sure the Genovese family didn't send crews into Harlem to take over every numbers bank and squeeze every dime out of people who could barely afford bread? Who would keep the delicate balance between the streets and the kind of full-scale race war that would bring federal heat down on everyone? Anastasia didn't care. To him, Harlem was just another piece of real estate to be conquered, occupied, and bled dry. He thought if he broke Bumpy in front of 40 witnesses, if he forced him to kneel and kiss the ring and admit that Harlem belonged to the Italians, the transition would be smooth. The territory would submit, business as usual. But Harlem didn't work that way. Harlem had survived things that would have destroyed lesser communities' slavery. Jim Crow, lynchings, race riots, police terror, economic strangulation designed to keep black people poor and desperate and dependent. The Italian mob's violence was nothing compared to what Harlem had already endured and survived. You couldn't conquer Harlem. You could only exist within it if you respected the rules. And Bumpy had spent 20 brutal years earning that right, sitting in that death sentence chair, surrounded by 40 professional killers who thought they had him trapped. Bumpy Johnson knew something none of them understood. This wasn't two gangsters negotiating territory. This was two fundamentally different systems of power, smashing into each other like tectonic plates. Anastasia's system ran on fear, on violence, on the cold mathematical certainty that the man with the most guns and the willingness to use them owned everything. Bumpy's system ran on necessity, on the understanding that some men hold together worlds that will shatter if they disappear. Anastasia ruled because men were terrified of him. Bumpy existed because without him, Harlem would burn. And that difference, that unbridgeable canyon between how they understood power, was about to turn this civilized dinner into a bloodbath. Albert Anastasia had built his entire empire on one ironclad truth: every man fears death. It was the foundation stone of Murder Incorporated, the principle that made men betray their brothers, abandon their families, and grovel for one more day of breathing. Fear of death made soldiers obedient, made bosses cautious, made rivals surrender before the first shot got fired. In 30 years of killing, Anastasia had sent over 60 men to their graves, and every single one of them had begged at the end. Every single one. But 3 days before the meeting at Ralph's restaurant, in Marcus Garvey Park, on a Tuesday, so unremarkable that nobody would have remembered it except for the conversation that happened there, Bumpy Johnson shattered that truth into pieces. It was late afternoon, autumn leaves falling like dying prayers. Bumpy was hunched over a chessboard playing speed rounds with an old street player named Clayton, moving pieces so fast the game looked like violence in miniature. That's when a man in a gray suit materialized on the bench across from them. No warning, no footsteps, just suddenly there, like death itself, sitting down uninvited. The man didn't introduce himself, didn't need to. His voice came out flat and emotionless, like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Friday night, Ralph's restaurant, 9:30 sharp. You're expected." Bumpy moved his bishop, eyes never leaving the board. Expected by who? People who don't appreciate being kept waiting. D. Clayton, who'd survived Harlem's streets for 68 years by knowing when to disappear, started to stand. Bumpy's hand shot out, clamped on his wrist hard enough to bruise. "Sit your ass down and finish the game." The man in the gray suit leaned forward. His whisper carried the weight of a gravestone. "This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Johnson. This is your one chance to avoid a war you can't win. You show up Friday night. You get on your knees in front of the right people. You apologize for operating without permission. And maybe you walk back to Harlem with your kneecaps intact. You don't show, or you show with an attitude problem, and they'll make an example so brutal your name will be a ghost story mothers use to scare their kids straight." Bumpy captured Clayton's queen. Checkmate in 3 moves. Clayton stared at the board like he was staring into an open grave, then stood without a word and walked away fast. The messenger didn't move. "You understand what I just told you?" Bumpy finally looked up. His eyes were dead calm. The kind of calm you see in condemned men who've stopped fighting the noose. "I understand perfect. Tell Mr. Anastasia. I'll be there. 9:30. Won't be late. And you'll do what's required." Bumpy's smile was colder than a meat locker. "I'll do exactly what needs doing." The messenger left, and for the next 72 hours, Bumpy Johnson prepared for a meeting he had absolutely no intention of surviving. He wrote a will, not some legal document that would hold up in probate court, but a blood-soaked letter of instructions sealed in an envelope and delivered to a lawyer who owed him 3 lifetimes of favors. Names, territories, which cops needed bribes doubled, which politicians needed reminding that their careers existed because Bumpy kept certain photographs locked in a safe. Who would run the numbers? Who would control the protection rackets? Who would make sure Harlem didn't become Italian property the second his body went cold? Then he met with preachers, 3 of them, in 3 different churches, having 3 versions of the same conversation. Never said what was coming, just reminded them quiet, calm, like discussing next Sunday's sermon that if the 5 families took control of Harlem, heroin would flood the streets like a biblical plague. Violence would spiral. Kids would die in crossfire. The neighborhood would become a free fire zone that would make the Tulsa massacre look like a bar fight. He made sure those conversations got overheard. Made sure the whispers spread through the right channels into the right ears. Bumpy Johnson's tying up loose ends. Bumpy Johnson is preparing for something catastrophic. Bumpy Johnson is getting ready to die. And when he goes, he's taking half of New York with him. Then he visited 2 aldermen and a crime reporter from the Amsterdam News. Didn't spell it out. Just dropped enough breadcrumbs that when his body turned up, if it turned up, the story would write itself. Italian mob executes Harlem's protector. Community leader murdered in cold blood. Racial violence erupts. He turned himself into a loaded gun pointed at the 5 families' heads. If Anastasia killed him in that room, in front of witnesses, the fallout wouldn't be containable. Harlem would explode. Protests, riots, federal investigations. Exactly the kind of heat that mobsters paid millions to avoid. And on Friday night, Bumpy put on his finest charcoal suit, slipped a straight razor into his inside pocket not for defense, but as a reminder of what he was willing to do, and walked into Ralph's restaurant like a man walking into his own execution, with a smile on his face. Because Bumpy Johnson had figured out the one thing Albert Anastasia, for all his genius at orchestrating murder, had never learned: there are fates worse than death. Dying afraid is worse. Dying as a coward is worse. Dying while your enemy writes history. Telling everyone how you sobbed and begged and kissed his feet like a beaten dog, that's worse than any bullet. But dying on your terms. Dying in a way that costs your enemy more than your life was worth. Dying so that your death becomes a weapon that keeps killing long after your heart stops. That's not defeat. That's checkmate. Bumpy didn't walk into Ralph's restaurant planning to survive. He walked in to weaponize his own death, to make sure that if Anastasia pulled the trigger, it wouldn't be quiet, wouldn't be forgotten, wouldn't be the kind of clean execution that gets buried in the news cycle within a week. He'd rigged himself like a bomb. If Anastasia killed him, the explosion would reach City Hall, the FBI, every newspaper north of the Mason-Dixon line. The preachers would call it martyrdom. The politicians would demand justice. The reporters would scream about racist mob violence. And Harlem, already simmering with rage about police brutality, economic oppression, and systemic violence, would detonate like nitroglycerin. Anastasia thought he was summoning a man desperate to live. What he'd actually summoned was a man who'd already chosen how he wanted to die, and was just waiting to see if Anastasia was stupid enough to give it to him. That's what made Bumpy Johnson the most dangerous man in that room. Not the one holding the gun. Not the one with 40 killers backing him up. The one who'd already sacrificed everything and was calmly waiting to see if you'd be dumb enough to make him a martyr. The order came like a death sentence wrapped in silk. "Stand up," Anastasia said. His voice was soft, almost gentle, the tone a father uses when teaching a child a lesson they'll never forget. "Walk to the center of this room. Get down on your knees. And apologize to every man here for disrespecting the order we've built." 40 men stopped breathing. This was it. The moment they'd all been waiting for. The public execution of Bumpy Johnson's reputation. The ritual humiliation that would echo through every social club, every card game, every dark corner of the underworld from Brooklyn to Chicago. They leaned forward in their chairs like spectators at a Roman Colosseum, hungry to watch a legend get torn apart. Bumpy didn't move, didn't stand, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Instead, his hand, steady as a surgeon's, reached across the white tablecloth and wrapped around the handle of his steak knife. It wasn't a weapon. Not really. Just a piece of cheap silverware, dull enough that it would take serious effort to puncture skin, short enough that you'd have to be kissing distance close to do any real damage. Nothing like the switchblades tucked into ankle holsters around the room. Nothing like the .38 revolvers concealed under jackets. Nothing like the piano wire Vincent the Chin Gigante probably had coiled in his pocket. But in that moment, that worthless piece of cutlery became the most dangerous object in New York City. Bumpy lifted the knife slowly. No sudden movements, no theatrical flourishes. Just a calm, deliberate motion that made every killer in that room tense like a wire about to snap. He turned the blade in his hand, examining it in the dim light like a jeweler appraising a diamond, then placed the tip against his own chest, right over his heart, right where the fabric of his charcoal suit pulled tight. Still didn't say a word. The silence in that room became something physical, something you could taste. 40 men who'd collectively murdered hundreds, maybe thousands, sat frozen, watching a man prepare to do something that made absolutely no sense and perfect sense all at once. Then Bumpy stood, not to obey Anastasia's command, not to walk to the center of the room and drop to his knees like a whipped dog. He stood with the knife still pressed against his chest, stood with the kind of posture you see in men facing a firing squad. And he turned to face Anastasia directly. The two men locked eyes across 6 feet of space that suddenly felt like the distance between life and death, between order and chaos, between the old world and whatever came next. And then Bumpy spoke. His voice was quiet, conversational, the tone you'd use to discuss the weather or the Yankees' chances next season. "You want me to kneel, Mr. Anastasia. You want me to apologize in front of all these men. You want me to admit that Harlem belongs to you and I've been operating on borrowed time." Anastasia's smile widened. He thought he'd won. That's exactly what I want. Bumpy's hand moved not fast, not violent, just a slow, inexorable shift that made every man in that room understand they were watching something that couldn't be undone. He extended his arm, offered the knife to Anastasia. Handle first. Then you're going to have to kill me, Bumpy said. Still calm, still steady. Right here, right now, in front of every witness in this room. You're going to have to take this knife, drive it into my chest, and explain to Harlem, to the preachers, to the politicians, to the reporters, to every man, woman, and child in that neighborhood why Anastasia murdered Bumpy Johnson in cold blood because I wouldn't get on my knees. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Anastasia's smile vanished, because in that instant, Bumpy had flipped the entire script. He'd taken Anastasia's carefully orchestrated ritual of dominance and turned it into a loaded gun pointed directly at the five families' collective head. If Anastasia took that knife and killed Bumpy right there, he'd win the battle but lose the war. 40 witnesses would spread the story the Italians executed a black community leader for refusing to submit. Harlem would explode. Federal investigators would descend like locusts. Every politician the mob had spent decades buying would suddenly discover principles and demand justice. The heat would be catastrophic, sustained, and impossible to contain. But if Anastasia didn't take the knife, if he backed down, if he let Bumpy walk out of that room alive and unbroken, then every man watching would know he'd blinked, would know that Bumpy Johnson had called his bluff in front of the most powerful killers in New York. And the Lord High Executioner had folded. Bumpy had handed Anastasia a choice between two types of defeat. Kill him and start a war you can't win cleanly. Let him live and admit you don't have the power you claim. Go ahead, Bumpy said, still holding out the knife, still offering it like a gift. 40 witnesses. They'll all testify you gave me a choice and I chose death over dishonor. That's the story that'll spread. That's what they'll remember. Not that you forced me to kneel, that I made you kill me because I refused. Trigger Mike Coppola's hand drifted toward his jacket. Vincent Gigante shifted his weight, ready to move. Frank Costello's cigarette burned down to ash between his fingers. Forgotten. But nobody moved, because they were all waiting to see what Anastasia would do. Waiting to see if the man who'd orchestrated 60 executions without hesitation would have the stomach to commit murder number 61 when the cost was this high. Anastasia stared at the knife, at Bumpy, at the 40 witnesses who would carry this story into history. And for the first time in 30 years of killing, Anastasia hesitated. Because Bumpy Johnson had done something no victim had ever done before. He'd given Anastasia complete control over his life. And in doing so, made Anastasia completely responsible for the consequences. If you hand your enemy the knife, you also hand him the bill for using it. 10 seconds. That's how long Anastasia stood there, staring at the knife in Bumpy Johnson's outstretched hand, calculating the cost of taking it. 10 seconds that stretched into eternity. 10 seconds where 40 professional killers, men who'd murdered, extorted, and terrorized their way to the top of New York's criminal hierarchy, sat frozen like statues in a museum. Afraid to breathe, afraid to blink, afraid to do anything that might break the spell and force the moment to its inevitable, catastrophic conclusion. Nobody coughed. Nobody shifted in their seats. Nobody reached for a weapon or a drink or even scratched an itch. The only sound in that room was the faint ticking of someone's wristwatch and the barely audible hum of the ventilation system struggling to circulate air through a space that had become a tomb. Bumpy didn't move, didn't lower the knife, didn't break eye contact, just stood there like a statue carved from obsidian, offering Anastasia the choice between war and humiliation with the same calm expression you'd see on a man offering you a cigarette. This was the moment everything hinged on. This was the fracture point where the old order could either reassert itself through violence or crack apart and let something new and terrifying emerge from the rubble. Anastasia's face was unreadable. No anger, no fear. Just cold calculation running behind his eyes like an abacus, counting the cost of every possible move. He was a master strategist, a man who'd survived 3 decades in a business where most men didn't make it 3 years. He understood power, understood leverage, understood that sometimes the smart play isn't the violent one. And right now, the math wasn't working in his favor. If he took that knife and buried it in Bumpy's chest, 40 men would watch him commit premeditated murder in front of witnesses. The story would be uncontrollable. Within hours, every newspaper in Harlem would be screaming about mob violence. Every preacher would be calling for justice from the pulpit. Every politician who'd taken mob money would suddenly need to prove their credentials by demanding investigations. The FBI would get involved. Grand juries would convene. And the 5 families who'd spent 50 years building an empire based on operating in the shadows would be dragged into the spotlight and burned alive by the heat. All because Bumpy Johnson refused to kneel. But if Anastasia backed down, if he let Bumpy walk out of this room with that knife still in his hand and his dignity intact, then every man in this room would know he'd been beaten. Would know that the Lord High Executioner, the most feared killer in the American Mafia, had been outmaneuvered by a black gangster from Harlem who had nothing but balls and a willingness to die on his own terms. The story would still spread, just a different version. Not Anastasia killed Bumpy Johnson, but Bumpy Johnson made Anastasia blink. Both outcomes were losses. The only question was which loss Anastasia could survive. Frank Costello, watching from 3 seats down, stubbed out his cigarette. The gesture was small, almost insignificant, but in that silent room it sounded like a gunshot. His eyes met Anastasia's for just a fraction of a second, a look that said everything without words. Don't do it. Not worth it. Too much heat. Back down. Anastasia's jaw tightened. And then, with the weight of every witness in that room pressing down on him like a physical force, Anastasia spoke. Sit down. 2 words. Quiet. Almost gentle. But they detonated like a bomb. Bumpy didn't move immediately. Let the words hang in the air. Let everyone in that room absorb what had just happened. Let the moment crystallize into something permanent. Something that would be remembered and retold for the next 50 years. Then, slowly, deliberately, Bumpy lowered the knife, placed it back on the table, adjusted his jacket, and sat back down in his chair with the same calm dignity he'd had when he stood up. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't say a goddamn word. He just sat there, alive and unbroken, while Anastasia, the man who'd ordered more executions than most people had eaten meals, stood in front of 40 witnesses, having just blinked first, in a staring contest he couldn't afford to lose. The room stayed silent, because everyone in it understood what they'd just witnessed wasn't a fight. It was a transfer of power, not the kind that happens with bullets and bloodshed, but the kind that happens when one man proves he's willing to die for his principles, and the other man proves he's not willing to pay the price of killing him. Anastasia turned away, sat back down, picked up his wine glass and took a long, slow drink like nothing had happened. But everyone in that room knew something had happened. Something fundamental. Something irreversible. The order to kneel had been given, and then it had been retracted. In the underworld, in the brutal hierarchy where respect was currency and weakness was death, that retraction was a wound that would never heal. Every man who'd watched Anastasia back down would carry that story, would whisper it in social clubs and card games and late-night meetings, would use it as proof that even the Lord High Executioner had limits. And Bumpy's Harlem would remain untouchable, not because Bumpy had won a fight, but because he'd made Anastasia choose between two types of losing and forced him to pick the one that kept Bumpy breathing. In this world, the winner isn't the man who gives the orders. It's the man who makes his enemy take those orders back. By midnight, the story had already infected every corner of New York's underworld like a virus with no cure. It started in Ralph's restaurant itself. The moment Bumpy Johnson walked out that door alive, unbroken, with his head held high, and that steak knife still sitting on the table where he'd placed it, the 40 witnesses exploded into motion. Men who'd sat frozen in silence for 10 agonizing seconds suddenly couldn't shut their mouths. They grabbed their coats, rushed to their cars, and raced to their respective territories with the most explosive piece of gossip the mob had generated in a decade. By 11 p.m., every social club in Little Italy knew. Bumpy Johnson had offered Anastasia a knife and dared him to use it. And Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, the man who'd sent 60 men to early graves without losing sleep, had backed down. By 11:30, the story had reached Brooklyn. Genovese soldiers were whispering about it in the back rooms of restaurants, passing the tale like contraband, each retelling adding new details, new drama. But the core remained unchanged. Anastasia blinked. The most feared killer in America had been outplayed by a black gangster from Harlem who walked into a death trap and turned it into a throne. By midnight, the Bronx knew. New Jersey knew. Queens, Staten Island, even crews as far out as Philadelphia and Boston were hearing fragments of the story through phone calls, hushed conversations, and messengers who showed up unannounced with news too big to wait until morning. And by 1 a.m., Harlem knew. The barbershops knew first. Old men playing dominoes outside Ray's on Lenox Avenue heard it from a numbers runner, who'd heard it from a cop, who'd heard it from a snitch who'd been in the right place at the right time. Within minutes, the story was being passed from shop to shop, corner to corner, stoop to stoop, spreading through the neighborhood's circulatory system faster than blood through a beating heart. Bumpy walked into Anastasia's trap and walked out a king. The preachers knew by morning. Reverend Powell heard it during his 6 a.m. coffee at the diner on 125th Street. By the time Sunday service rolled around, 3 different ministers had worked oblique references into their sermons' parables about Daniel in the lion's den, David facing Goliath, men who refused to bow before false idols even when death was staring them in the face. Nobody mentioned Bumpy by name. Didn't need to. Everyone in those pews knew exactly who they were talking about, and the politicians knew within 48 hours. Aldermen who'd spent years carefully balancing their relationships with both Harlem's black community and the Italian mob suddenly understood that the power structure had shifted, that Harlem wasn't just another territory to be divided up and exploited, that Bumpy Johnson had just proved something the 5 families had spent decades denying: you couldn't break Harlem's through intimidation. You couldn't own it through violence. You could only negotiate with it as an equal or leave it the hell alone. But the real change wasn't in the stories. It was in the silence that followed. Within a week, the tribute demands stopped. The Genovese family soldiers who'd been pressuring Harlem numbers operators to kick up a percentage suddenly found other priorities. The collectors who'd been showing up at basement gambling joints demanding protection money stopped showing up. No formal announcement, no official declaration. Just a quiet, unanimous understanding that Harlem was now off limits. Nobody wanted to be the crew that tried what Anastasia failed to do. Nobody wanted to walk into Harlem demanding submission after the most dangerous man in the mob had been forced to back down. Because if Anastasia couldn't break Bumpy Johnson, what chance did anyone else have? The Italian crews who'd been eyeing Harlem's lucrative numbers rackets, salivating over the millions flowing through that neighborhood every week, suddenly decided those millions weren't worth the cost. wasn't worth the heat, wasn't worth the risk of going to war with a man who'd already proved he'd rather die than kneel. Frank Costello, always the pragmatist, called a quiet meeting with his captains 3 days after the incident. Didn't discuss it directly, just made it clear that Harlem was now considered autonomous territory, a diplomatic way of saying hands off. Don't ask questions, and if anyone violates this, they're on their own. The Lucchese family followed suit, then the Colombos, then the Bonanos, one by one. The 5 families quietly, informally, without ever admitting they were doing it, redrew the map of New York to exclude Harlem from their sphere of control. Not because they were afraid of Bumpy's guns, not because they couldn't have sent 50 soldiers into Harlem and burned it to the ground if they wanted to, but because Bumpy had made the cost too high, had turned himself into a problem that couldn't be solved cleanly, had demonstrated that breaking him would require a level of public violence, federal scrutiny, and political blowback that no mob boss in his right mind would willingly trigger. He'd weaponized his own dignity, and in doing so, he'd created a buffer around Harlem that was stronger than any army. The street soldiers whispered about it in bars. The made men discussed it in social clubs. The bosses referenced it in coded language during commission meetings. But nobody, not one single person in the entire New York underworld was stupid enough to test whether Bumpy Johnson would make the same choice twice. Because the story had become legend. And legends have power that bullets can't touch. True power doesn't announce itself with proclamations or press releases or public displays of dominance. True power is recognized by what people stop doing, by the tribute that stops getting collected, by the threats that stop getting made, by the territory that suddenly becomes untouchable not because it's defended by armies, but because the cost of attacking it is too high for anyone to pay. After that night at Ralph's restaurant, nobody in New York ever demanded that Harlem kneel again. Not because they couldn't, because they'd seen what happened to the last man who tried. On October 25th, 1957, exactly 1 year and 11 days after the night at Ralph's restaurant, Albert Anastasia walked into the barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan for his regular morning shave. He never walked out. 2 gunmen in scarves and fedoras materialized from behind him while he sat in the barber's chair, face covered in hot towels. Completely vulnerable. They fired 10 shots at point-blank range. 5 hit him in the head and back. The Lord High Executioner died before he hit the floor, blood pooling under the chair, his face still half covered in shaving cream. The murder was execution style. Professional. Clean. The kind of hit Anastasia himself had ordered dozens of times. The killers vanished into the Manhattan morning like ghosts. No witnesses came forward. No arrests were ever made. The case went cold within months, and every single person in New York's underworld knew or thought they knew who was behind it. Carlo Gambino, Anastasia's underboss, took control of the family within hours. Vito Genovese consolidated power across multiple families. The commission restructured. Territory got redistributed. The mob's internal politics shifted like tectonic plates. And when the dust settled, a new order had emerged with different bosses, different alliances, different rules. But one name was conspicuously absent from all the speculation. All the whispered accusations. All the theories about who'd greenlit the hit Bumpy Johnson. Nobody seriously believed Bumpy had anything to do with Anastasia's murder. He didn't have the connections to organize a hit in Midtown. Didn't have relationships with the Gambino or Genovese crews. Didn't operate in those circles. And most importantly, didn't have a motive. Anastasia had already backed down, already left Harlem alone. Already acknowledged through his silence that Bumpy couldn't be broken. The smart money said it was internal mob politics. A power play by Gambino and Genovese to eliminate a boss who'd become too unpredictable, too violent, too much of a liability. Anastasia had made enemies, lots of them. His death was the inevitable result of 3 decades spent ruling through fear and brutality. But here's the thing about legends: they don't need facts. They need narratives. And the narrative that emerged in Harlem's barbershops, pool halls, and street corners wasn't about Carlo Gambino or Vito Genovese. It was about karma, about cosmic justice, about what happens to men who try to force other men to their knees. Anastasia tried to break Bumpy, the old-timers would say. Sitting on stoops in the summer heat, watching the neighborhood move around them. Year later, somebody broke Anastasia. That's how the world works. You put violence into the universe. Violence comes back for you. Nobody claimed Bumpy had pulled the trigger. Nobody even hinted at it. But the proximity of the two events, the confrontation at Ralph's, the assassination at the Park Sheraton, created a symbolic connection that was stronger than any factual link. Bumpy had defied death. Anastasia had delivered it to others for 30 years. One lived, one died. The universe had balanced the scales. And Bumpy Johnson, the man at the center of this mythology, did absolutely nothing to confirm or deny it. He didn't celebrate Anastasia's death, didn't reference it, didn't drop hints or make veiled comments or take credit in any way. When reporters asked him about it, and they did, sensing a story, Bumpy's response was consistent and maddeningly opaque. "Mr. Anastasia and I had our disagreement. It got resolved. I had nothing to do with what happened after." He didn't attend the funeral, didn't send flowers, didn't acknowledge the death beyond that single bland statement. And that silence, that absolute refusal to capitalize on his enemy's murder, made him more powerful than any gloating or celebration could have, because it proved something the Underworld desperately needed to see. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a gangster looking to expand his empire, wasn't trying to take over the Italian mob's territory, wasn't using Anastasia's death as an opportunity to push into Brooklyn, Queens, or New Jersey. He just wanted Harlem left alone. That's it. That's all he'd ever wanted. And by refusing to exploit Anastasia's murder, by keeping his head down and his operations exactly where they'd always been, Bumpy sent a message more powerful than any threat: I'm not your enemy, unless you make me your enemy. Leave me alone, and I'll leave you alone. Try to break me, and you'll discover I'm more expensive to fight than I'm worth. The new bosses, Gambino, Genovese. The restructured commission got the message loud and clear. Harlem stayed autonomous. Bumpy stayed in power. And the unspoken rule established that night at Ralph's restaurant remained in effect. Don't fuck with Harlem, and Harlem won't fuck with you. The strongest move isn't always the aggressive one. Sometimes the strongest move is knowing when you've already won and having the discipline not to push further. Bumpy could have used Anastasia's death to expand, could have leveraged the chaos to grab territory, make alliances, build an empire that rivaled the 5 families. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, did exactly what he'd always done. And in doing so, he turned himself from a threat into a permanent fixture, untouchable not because he was invincible, but because attacking him served no purpose. The strongest man in the room isn't the one who seizes every opportunity. It's the one who knows when he doesn't need to. Bumpy Johnson never ruled New York. Let's be absolutely clear about that. He never sat at the commission table, never controlled the docks, the unions, the construction industry, the garment district. Never had politicians in his pocket beyond a few local aldermen. Never commanded armies of soldiers spread across 5 boroughs. Never built the kind of empire that the Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families had constructed over 5 decades of blood, intimidation, and systematic corruption. He ruled Harlem. That's it. 12 square miles in Upper Manhattan. A black neighborhood that most of white America pretended didn't exist, and the Italian mob had written off as too poor, too complicated, too politically dangerous to be worth the effort of conquering. But after that night at Ralph's restaurant, something fundamental shifted in how the underworld understood power. The old order had been simple: the strong dominate the weak. The crews with the most guns, the most soldiers, the most political connections controlled the territory. If you operated in New York, you either paid tribute to the five families or you died. No exceptions, no negotiations, no special circumstances. That system had worked for half a century. It had built criminal empires that generated billions of dollars, corrupted entire government agencies, and controlled industries from shipping to entertainment. It was brutally efficient, ruthlessly enforced, and universally accepted. Until one man proved it had limits. Bumpy didn't destroy that system, didn't replace it, didn't even challenge its legitimacy in territories beyond Harlem. He just carved out one small exception, one neighborhood where the rules didn't apply, where tribute didn't get paid, where the mob's authority ended at an invisible border that everyone understood but nobody had officially drawn. And that exception, that single 12-square-mile zone of autonomy, created a crack in the foundation of the entire structure. Because if Harlem could operate outside the system, what stopped other neighborhoods from trying the same thing? What stopped the Irish in Hell's Kitchen from refusing tribute? What stopped the Jews on the Lower East Side from declaring independence? What stopped every ethnic enclave in New York from looking at what Bumpy had accomplished and asking themselves, why are we paying these Italians for permission to exist in our own neighborhoods? The answer, of course, was that none of those other neighborhoods had a Bumpy Johnson. None of them had a leader willing to walk into a room full of killers and offer them a choice between war and peace, knowing full well that war meant his own death. None of them had the community infrastructure, the political connections, the sheer mythological weight necessary to make defiance sustainable. But the precedent had been set. The crack had appeared, and the five families, for all their power and brutality, understood that trying to close that crack would cost more than leaving it open. So they adapted, redrew their internal maps, treated Harlem as a separate entity, not officially, not in any documented way, but in the quiet understanding that shaped how business got conducted. Harlem became the exception that proved the rule, the one place where the normal order didn't apply. And Bumpy Johnson became something unique in the history of organized crime, a gangster who'd won not by expanding his territory, but by making it too expensive to conquer. 50 years later, long after Bumpy was dead and buried, long after the Italian mob's golden age had ended and new players had taken control of New York's criminal underworld, the story of that night at Ralph's restaurant was still being told, still being passed down from one generation to the next, still being analyzed, mythologized, and used as a teaching moment about power, dignity, and the cost of fighting battles you don't need to win. The details got blurred over time. Some versions said Bumpy pulled a gun instead of a knife. Others claimed he threatened to burn down half of Manhattan if Anastasia killed him. A few insisted that Bumpy had actually orchestrated Anastasia's murder a year later, though no evidence ever supported that theory. But the core of the story remained unchanged. A man was ordered to kneel. He refused. And the person who gave the order backed down. That's the part that mattered. That's the part that survived every retelling, every exaggeration, every mythological enhancement. Because that part was true in the way that myths are true, not necessarily in the literal facts, but in the deeper meaning. In a world built on domination, submission, and the threat of violence, one man proved that there are things more powerful than fear, that dignity can be a weapon, that the willingness to die on your own terms can be more threatening than any gun. Bumpy Johnson didn't change the world, didn't reform the mob, didn't end organized crime or make New York a safer place. Harlem still had poverty, violence, addiction, and all the systemic problems that plagued black communities across America. But for 12 square miles in Upper Manhattan, for one neighborhood that had spent centuries being told to kneel, to submit, to accept its place at the bottom of the hierarchy, Bumpy Johnson had proved something that couldn't be unproven. It was possible to stand. Not without cost, not without risk, not without the willingness to sacrifice everything, but possible. And in a world that constantly demands submission, that possibility, that single proof that resistance isn't always suicide, is more valuable than any empire. The question the story leaves behind isn't whether you'll survive. Survival is never guaranteed. The question is when the moment comes, when someone puts you in that chair and orders you to kneel, when every rational calculation says submission is the smart choice and defiance is death. What will you choose? Will you kneel and keep breathing, or will you stand and accept the consequences? Bumpy Johnson made his choice in a locked restaurant surrounded by 40 killers on October 25, 1956. The world is still trying to figure out what that choice meant. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, not from a bullet or a blade, but from a heart attack in Harlem streets, still standing, still free, still unbroken. The neighborhood he protected stayed autonomous until the day he took his last breath. Anastasia's empire crumbled the moment those bullets tore through him in that barber's chair. One man ruled through fear and died forgotten. The other stood his ground and became immortal. So here's the question that matters. If someone put you in that chair tonight and demanded you kneel, your career, your dignity, everything you've built on the line, would you have the guts to reach for that knife? Drop your answer in the comments, And if this story changed how you think about power, hit that subscribe button. Because legends like this don't die. They just wait for someone brave enough to retell them.